Everyone, this work session aims to provide education on core issues related to facial recognition technologies, including existing policies, legal frameworks, and the potential threats to individual privacy and civil liberties. Facial recognition technology is an automated or semi-automated process that assists in identifying or verifying an individual based on an individual's face. This technology has recently been banned for the cities of San Francisco in May, Somerville, Massachusetts in June, and Oakland, California in August. These bans are due to concerns around privacy and intrusiveness, the lack of transparency, gender and race bias, which triggers many ethical dilemmas and potential harm related to civil rights and civil liberties. In a 2018 report by the MIT lab, Gender Shades, Intersection Accuracy Disparities in Commercial Gender Classification, the study concluded that facial recognition systems worked best on white males and failed most often with the combination of female and dark-skinned individuals with error rates of up to 34.7%. The study used a data set of 1,270 people, meaning a large data set. Similar studies support those ethical concerns and expose current limitations to the effectiveness of facial recognition. This work session will focus on facial recognition. However, the intention of the privacy work group coordinated by Smart City PDX and the Office of Equity and Human Rights is to develop more comprehensive policies that include other surveillance technologies. Such policies would need to include procedures for responsible use, procurement, due diligence, and due care of technological solutions to minimize negative impacts in our communities. Surveillance technologies include any software, electronic device, system utilizing an electronic device, or similar device used, designed, or primarily intended to collect, retain, process, or share audio, electronic, visual, location, thermal, biometric, olfactory, or similar information specifically associated with or capable of being associated with any individual or group. A central goal of the Smart City PDX program is to use data to address inequities and disparities through investing in technology and data-driven projects that improve people's lives with a focus on Portland's marginalized communities. I'd like to turn this over to Commissioner Hardesty for some opening comments.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, colleagues and folks who will be testifying today for being here around this really important issue. I'm excited by the work that Smart Cities PDX work group is doing around protecting Portlanders' privacy. Looking at all the different types of surveillance technology that could be deployed in our city and working to limit the use of technology is critical work. While the larger work will be done over the next year, I'm also excited that we're looking to take the critically important first step of banning facial recognition software in the city of Portland. Not only the city's use of technology, but also limiting the use of software by private entities. I appreciate the Smart Cities and Borough staff for reaching out to community organizations and seeking input on these important issues very early in the process. I hope that there will be continued outreach to those that are most impacted by the effects of facial recognition software and that community groups will stay engaged in this critically important work. These are matters of privacy, consent, and civil rights. The technology is currently extremely biased against people of color and women. But even if these problems are improved on automated surveillance and collections of people's biometric data is unacceptable. We need to take a strong stand that the automated surveillance state is not welcome in the city of Portland. I've heard about many compelling suggestions for ways to expand this proposal or other types of technology that we should examine banning. These ideas are worth examining over the course of the committee's lifespan, but expanding the current proposal beyond the scope of facial recognition software would slow down this process substantially and prevent us from implementing this important ban in a timely manner. Because this software is so unreliable as it relates to women and communities of color, we will never, ever, ever, ever be able to improve the technology on the software so that it is not biased in how it is used and how the data is collected. And so rather than trying to fix something after it's been broken and after this expand out, I am very proud to be part of a city that's willing to send a very clear message early on that we respect people's right to privacy, and we do not want to enable any technology that starts off over misidentifying people of color and women. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the presentations today.
Did any of my, Nick or Amanda?
I just wanted
Commissioner
to
Fritz?
thank Commissioner Hardesty for your leadership on this and for working with the Office of Equity and Human Rights on the. I think we've done this really carefully. It took a long time to develop the privacy policy, and we adopted that, and now we're moving to what does that mean in specific cases. So I'm just really happy to be on a city council that is willing to work together and use the expertise in our bureaus to get really good policy. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Good morning. First up, Judith Mallory and Hector Dominguez. Good morning.
Yeah,
Thanks
good
for
morning, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. For us, it's really we feel this duty of doing our best to bring the best that technology can offer to everyone here in Portland. Also to make sure that that technology is being used in a responsible way. That works for everyone, regardless of who you are.
Do we want to say something about the screen being behind it?
Yeah, we have, just in terms of logistics, we are going to have a couple of presentations, so we may ask you to move. And then we have 3 excellent guest speakers joining us today. 2 of them remotely, and I'm going to describe more about their expertise.
Do we have a printout of the PowerPoint?
We do have a printout of. You can use
No,
mine.
but for all my comments, or we can move. What
Yeah.
do you prefer?
One of them's a video, and it's up to you.
I love video. So I'm gonna move. I want to see the video.
All right. Thank you so much for being flexible. We appreciate that.
We'll go with the flow kind of people.
And let me be clear, this is also a session where we invite you to ask questions. We invite you to start all these different conversations and make sure that the time that these experts that are joining today are being used properly, and we can get from them what we need. All right, so quick review to the agenda today. Judith and myself, we are going to start a very quick presentation on the work that we are currently doing in the city. a brief introduction to what facial recognition is, and then we are going to invite Brian Hofer, who is the chair commissioner at the Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission, to share his experience working on the facial recognition policies with different municipalities, literally all over the country, mostly California. Then Claire Garvey, she is senior associate at the Center for Privacy and Technology from Georgetown Law University. She's going to, her work she's doing has done some research around the legal limits and the state of facial recognition technologies and the impacts in society. While we have here in person Pam Dixon, who's executive director of the World Privacy Forum, where Pam, she's going to share her world global expertise on not only facial recognition, but also surveillance technologies, biometrics, and IDs in general. And then we close with some final discussions and statements. And this is just to warm up. So I was with my wife one day, and then I spoke in softly, and she asked me why I spoke so softly in the house. Well, I said I was afraid of Mark Zuckerberg, that Mark Zuckerberg was listening. And then she laughed, and I laughed, and then Alexa laughed, and then Siri laughed. This is a quick joke, really silly joke, but exactly. Yeah, just to highlight that right now our lives are being streamed live in many different ways. We are embedded in a digital world, and we all need to be aware of what that means. And that's one of the reasons why Smart City PDX program was created. It's a way in which the city can actually start looking into what the meaning of these emerging technologies. And we are trying to start with very solid foundations. So Smart City PDX has developed an equity priorities framework, which basically puts at the center of all technological installations, discussions, proposals, equity, basically. So equity from to really serve those who have been underserved and to really look into the value that technology brings into the city. And just a few months ago, the city passed our privacy principles also to highlight the importance that information is not the same for everyone. Information is actually really is an important asset. It has a huge potential, but we need to start developing better ways of for governance with information and data. How we collect, how we manage, how we store, how we process that information, and ultimately how we put the end of life of that within the city. So we have been, it's been a long road. So it really started last year when I say we, Smart City PDX and the Bureau of Equity and Human Rights, we started looking into what the privacy principles would look like after a year of work, talking to many people in the city, different agencies. So we brought the principles to City Council, and they were unanimously approved. So the next step is how do we implement those principles? That's why we have we put together a privacy work group, which is intended to last only 1 year, and with the goal of defining those strategies on how those principles are going to be implemented, what's the implications for the city, and what are going to be the next steps for that. And within that privacy work group, we have two main subgroups, let's put it like that. One is privacy in general, from how we collect data, how we implement privacy by design in the city, for instance, who has the roles of within the city to access specific sensitive information, how do we protect that confidential and sensitive information much better in the city, and also developing policies and procedures around surveillance technologies. And within that group, one of the very first steps was facial recognition, as we see it as having a really national stage right now, that technology, and we need to act more quickly than ever. Anyways, in order to do that, we believed in a process where we engage community from the beginning. That's why last couple of weeks ago, on September 5th, we made a call specifically to organizations and stakeholders involved from all these different aspects in lives for the city, from civil liberties and civil rights, people who are developing technology, people who are concerned about privacy, business associations, academic centers, and just individuals who are actively working on this area to start having these conversations on specifically facial recognition, but in the more general conversation on facial recognition, on surveillance technology, excuse me. So our principles are very innovative in a way. So we are following what most of the cities have. However, we are adding two main aspects to those principles. One is automated decision systems, which is right now reflection on how data and information is being processed by third parties and in a global and international environment. And also data utility, which means that everything that we do with data and information has to bring some value to the city, and we're just going to collect the minimum amount of private and personal information from people in the city and whoever interacts with the city. I mentioned about the privacy work group. We have two main aspects of that. So how do we develop better privacy strategies and governance, and then how do we start developing policy around surveillance technologies. Within this privacy work group, there is a number of agencies in the city that includes the Office of Equity and Human Rights, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, our program Smart City PDX, the Office for Community Technology, City Attorney's Office, Public Records, City Attorney's Office, Technology, BTS, Information Security Office, our Police Bureau, our Auditor's Office, Portland Bureau of Transportation, Community and Civic Life, Office of Management and Finance, Archives and Records Management, Portland Water Bureau, Bureau of Human Resources, and Risk Management in OMF.
I just have to acknowledge our closed captioning for a moment. That was a masterful closed captioning.
That's awesome. And with that, I'm going to let my colleague Judith Mori to keep the conversation.
So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here and having us. So, as we talked about earlier, and I think actually you read this exact piece, Mayor, so we don't need to reread the slide, but surveillance technology is anything that can collect information on your personal being. Can we switch to that? Yes.
Could I ask you a question about that while we're on that topic? And I've had some really good conversations with Commissioner Hardesty, and overall, I strongly support putting controls in place so that this technology doesn't happen to us. I'd rather it unfold in a way where we have the opportunity to stop, take a breather, and take a look at what the surveillance implications are and the privacy and civil rights implications are. But there is a difference to me in my mind between a surveillance technology where we are not completely aware that it's taking place versus, for example, picking up an iPhone and using facial recognition because it's more convenient or because it's the only way I can access my iPhone. So that is a personal choice. And I want to make sure that in our conversations we are separating those two. Is that a fair statement that we are making that separation between self-actuated and agreed upon versus third-person surveillance?
Well, I believe we are, but I think it's something that we should keep as a critical lens as we have the conversation to make sure that we're sort of constantly remembering that. What's really important about what we're doing is we're government. So we have a certain kind of power and access over people's lives that, and yeah, you can have individual Google and all of that, but government has a very specific sort of power. And so that's why when we talk about government, I think that it's just put that in with that thought of what is consensual, what are you, deciding to do on your own, what is being collected about you that you're aware of, but you may not, and all you get is the warning that it's being collected. I mean, there are things the city collects that we say, we're just going to collect this, we're going to let you know we're collecting it.
Yeah.
And then you also just have, and then looking at the fact that in my mind, all information is so, it's vulnerable, right? And so thinking about how that information gets used and always thinking about how are the most vulnerable people in the community being impacted by any choices that we make as government. That's how I see it.
And just one final point, I want to make it crystal clear in case it's not. We're not afraid of the technology.
No.
It's how the technology could potentially be abused or misused without our knowledge.
Yes.
So I want to be really clear. We're not trying to shut down technological adaptation. We're not trying to stymie innovative or creative ideas that make our lives easier or more convenient. But it's this sort of nefarious, unknown surveillance and use of data without our knowledge or permission that we're trying to address here. And I just want to be very, very clear about that.
Absolutely. I mean, we are far from a Luddite movement here. I mean, we embrace
exactly.
technology, and as Hector said, we are embedded in a digital world. So, and there's lots of ways we use the technology that is really phenomenal, make all of our lives better.
I just wanted to reiterate a point that the mayor made yesterday. I mean, you answered about government, but we also want to ban this technology for being used in the private sector for ways that we don't believe are appropriate, right? But I also want to reinforce that for some people, like people who are blind, people with other disabilities, this kind of technology really helps them to really be engaged in the community. So our goal is, I believe, is to balance both,
Yes.
right? Is to make sure that we're not cutting off opportunity, but at the same time, we're not letting private companies gather our data and do with it as they will, right?
Absolutely, so we can move on, I think, everybody. So this is a list that we put together just talking about some of the tools, and I'm sorry, this slide I thought I was starting on slide 10, I confess.
I can jump in
Would you-
here.
thank you.
This is just a brief list of different surveillance technologies. You can see that even if it's like relatively brief, we are talking about automated license plate readers, body-worn cameras, CCTVs, cell-site simulators, connected transportation, de-identification of public data, digital signs, drones, gunshot detectors, facial recognition, location services, GPS, for instance, public broadband, RFID, Bluetooth, smart cards and payment, smart grids, smart meters, social network monitoring, environmental sensors, satellite imagery. So, and all those technologies bring really great value. They can bring great value, but also when they are not used in a responsible way, they can create harm to specific communities, mostly those vulnerable. And now, yes.
Yes, thank you. So, basically facial recognition is technology that uses biometrics to identify who you are. The biometrics being, I believe, it starts with your eyes and then they kind of build out from that. And it can be used in real time, so you can, just put it on and find out right away if it's working correctly. But as was pointed out earlier, particularly by Commissioner Hardesty, there are quite a few issues in terms of its ability to work well. Why don't we go to video?
Okay, let's go
Yeah.
to the... One second. Looks like it's muted.
Yeah.
It's not muted.
Maybe your computer's on mute?
Just have captions.
Yeah. but he worked.
You said technology brings great value.
There it is.
It's very low.
It is very low.
Lots.
So the caption is not going to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's very low.
No,
So
I
this
guess
was-
you might want to tell us what.
Yeah, this was a study that was done where they looked at, they took pictures of famous African-American women and put them through facial recognition technology. Pardon me?
It's actually not facial recognition.
Thank you. Sojourner Truth was identified as a man.
Do we have someone in the booth? Can we just take a pause for a second, because if we can't hear it, and there may be a problem with,
Can you tap on the speaker? Where is that? Sorry, full.
Yeah.
Yep.
There was my obvious contribution to technology today. Let
Yeah.
the record show that.
So, yeah, we can recap and then keep moving. So basically, this is the, she is Joy Bulamwini, and she is an MIT researcher, basically. Her work highlights the different biases embedded in facial recognition, and this particular video I personally like because it's a mixture between arts and technology, and also because highlighting mostly the how in dark faces, and when the dark faces is coming from a black woman, those biases are the worst. Identifying some culturally specific features for those faces is also troublesome for some of these algorithms that have not been trained to identify that, for instance. So, and let's keep moving forward.
Yes, so, and you can look that up on YouTube. It's a great video. I really recommend everybody find it to watch it. AI, Ain't I a Woman? AI, Ain't I a Woman? Yes. And just, spoiler alert, all of the black women that they were identifying, the AI identified as men. So just that's what happens in the video. But so we know there's racial and gender issues. There's a lot of other potential problems with facial recognition. It can easily be collected in public places without your knowledge. It's really it opens things to predatory marketing. I was really kind of taken aback to read that it can be done they can actually try to prey on vulnerable customers by looking for segmenting extreme emotions such as distress and tailoring their products to those emotions that are being expressed by the people that they are surveilling. It also can be a disadvantage when applying for jobs. AI can tell you can use that as an entree into learning a lot about people. Another piece, and I think this is a piece that really concerns me, is the potential for stalking. And I think that it really leaves open a really vulnerable population, which we really need to think about that, because people take these little bits of information from all these different sources, and they can put together a full profile of where you live, where you're going, what you're doing, and so it can be very dangerous for folks who are being stalked. It's opening things to identity fraud, so it has a lot of these issues, and I think it's important that we just recognize that piece. Do we have a next slide? So now, excitingly, we're going to get to the people who really know what they're talking about, our experts. And I'm going to turn it over, actually, to Hector to introduce our first speaker.
So we have three excellent speakers, experts in the field. So Brian Hofer, he has presented his work at conferences sponsored by the California Department of Justice, Protecting Our Community, Respecting Our Liberties, RiceCon, Silicon Valley, Left Forum, the rise of big surveillance, how Oakland pushed back and won the 11th Hove Conference, and the list goes and goes. Brian is currently the chair for the City of Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission since 2016. Thank you. He's also the chair for Domain Awareness Center, an ad hoc privacy committee, or has been from 2014 to 2015. And Brian's current legislative record is 20-0, when 25 unanimously yes vote for these kind of technologies. So let me jump, and hopefully we are having. Yeah. Brian, all right.
Opportunity and your whole team. I really applaud the city of Portland, for just like Seattle and Oakland and others that are taking these really fast emerging technologies seriously and looking at the impacts that they can do in our communities. I really applaud you guys. You're ahead of us on the privacy principles portion. We've been looking actually at your model in Seattle. I think we're ahead of you in other areas with regard to how we have a vetting framework for surveillance equipment. But I think we're, similar cities, Oakland and Portland. We have very progressive politics, sanctuary cities. We've each had our troubles with ICE. We have a healthy activist and protest culture. But we're also very tech-friendly and tech-savvy people. And, just like anybody else, I like the features that technology is giving me as to convenience and just more information at my fingertips. It's a pretty amazing but also scary time to deal with this stuff just due to the rapid pace that it gets adopted. I'm gonna start first talking kind of just the background of Oakland and how we got a privacy commission and our overall vetting framework, and then close with the Bay Area facial recognition successes that we've had. And just to let you know, as an update, we cleared Berkeley, their public safety committee, yesterday by unanimous vote, using the same ban language as San Francisco and Oakland. And this evening, I'm going to be in Emeryville, a neighboring city. They're introducing the same ban as well. And I'm aware of 4 more cities outside of California that are going to be joining us soon. So it's not just a Bay Area bubble thing. I think people kind of understand the creepiness factor of this technology because it does work at a distance, because cameras are already everywhere. We just need to apply analytics and we could have a perfect citywide mass surveillance system. So back in 2013, June, Edward Snowden hit the front pages. 2 weeks later, the city of Oakland tried to slide under the radar a mass surveillance system called the Domain Awareness Center. It was going to aggregate license plate readers, facial recognition, had over 700 cameras, shot spotter data, 300 terabytes of video. It was going to aggregate everything. It was going to share data with the feds. And this was coming on the tail end of Occupy. Our Occupy Oakland did not end so well. And out of that concern, and I think also just the strength of the Occupy movement, the law enforcement decided that they wanted a lot more surveillance equipment in this city. So citizens discovered it, and after a sustained campaign, we were able to scuttle that project, and it created an ad hoc privacy commission, the Domain Awareness Center ad hoc. So we were supposed to write a privacy policy for the city of Oakland because we didn't have any. We were keeping license plate reader data up to 5 years until our server crashed. That's the only reason we changed our policy for license plate readers. We had no other use policies, no citizen input into any other surveillance equipment. So during this 2014-15 period, as we're on the ad hoc committee, we were able to convince the city to make it a permanent body and to say, we need a vetting framework for all technology. We can't just do this, or it's not wise to just do these kind of one-off whack-a-mole approaches as equipment comes up. We should really have a framework. And it was very fortuitous that the ACLU came out with their model ordinance. You might have seen the acronym by now, CCOPS, Community Control Over Policing Surveillance. And I sent along, I don't know if you guys have hard copies or if you can look at it later, but I sent along a copy of the Davis ordinance because it comes with a really nice staff report that just really lays out in very easy to understand language how the sequence flows, what's required. And the general intent is really mindfulness and ongoing oversight, but it's mindfulness. I can't tell you how many council members I've had ask, publicly right on the dais, like, well, how would we ever know what capabilities we have, or how will we know what the impact of this equipment is? It's going to be impossible to comply with this ordinance. And we, of course, have to turn that around and say, why would you ever put that equipment out in the wild if you don't understand what it could do? How do you know how invasive this is if you're just blindly going forward? And so what we require under this model is an impact statement. You have to do an analysis up front to the best of your ability. Sometimes that's hard, with a brand new technology, but generally, especially on the private sector side, there's been some research done, or at the university level, there's been some research done. And so you have to have a discussion, have a public debate about how impactful this equipment is. It should highlight concerns like license plate readers, right? It's mass surveillance. We drive all around our cities. We collect people's locational travel habits. That's invasive. So let's discuss that. Along with the impact statement, it comes with the proposed use policy, so that the proponent will tell us how they intend to use that equipment, specific enumerated uses. The concerns raised in the impact statement should be addressed or mitigated to the extent possible by the use policy. Maybe we make data retention shorter. Maybe we don't have third-party data sharing with ICE. Maybe we have encryption. So there's various categories of information that must be supplied and addressed, and there's also a cost-benefit analysis. At the end of the day, do the benefits outweigh the concerns? And that's an important function. And under the model, there's also ongoing oversight. It's not just approve it and forget. Every year, for each piece of approved equipment, you got to come back to us with an annual report with robust reporting metrics to demonstrate not only that you've been using the equipment properly, that there's little or hopefully no disparate impact, but also that it achieved its purpose. Does it actually work? And I can tell you from having this privileged seat at the table with the Privacy Commission, some of the stuff you guys are just wasting your money on. It does not achieve public safety, and there's only a downside to it. And so we should just stop using that equipment. It's not achieving its intended purpose, and it's costing us money. Keep in mind, Oakland, our police department, we are just now entering our record-setting 17th year of federal monitoring. I'm sure you've seen a lot of our protests on TV and heard our horror stories. We've had a significant number of officer-involved shootings. So it's been a very delicate walk these last few years. But I can tell you, and I've been publicly saying it, the Oakland Police Department has been shining under this model, and I really think it's because they bought in, they understand the mindfulness component, and they're willing to or glad to really get the benefits from participation. I strongly encourage you, if you do go forward with a vetting framework, like I've discussed with some of you, that you do have a citizens commission involved. Not only does it give more participation, but as the police begin to hear from more regular citizens, and there's just a better two-way conversation, trust gets developed. Things are more transparent. People are more responsible to their community. And so it's been working really well. We have 7 of these ordinances in California. I've co-authored 5 of them. Only one, Oakland, has the Privacy Commission, and I think that's why we've been having just the results that we've had. Not only harm reduction, right? Why are we writing policies in the first place? Well, hopefully we're defending civil liberties. How I'm defining, harm reduction, or what I'm interpreting is less use, narrow use, shorter data retention, but still having good metrics like making arrests, that sort of thing, so that we can still have the intended benefit without hopefully any lawsuits or civil liberties concerns coming from that. We have the Department of Race and Equity, just like you folks. We work very closely with them when the annual reports come forward to just make sure it's like the lack of disparate impact. ESF the Electronic Frontier Foundation analyzed our license plate reader data a couple years ago, and even after controlling for property crime, for stolen vehicles, they found that our travel patterns, the way our routes were going with license plate readers, were still disproportionately targeting certain communities of color. And so that resulted in a policy change and to change that type of behavior. And so ideally, that's what the annual report is going to lead to, either true non-controversial successes where the equipment's working as it's supposed to, or it's going to raise an awareness of a policy change that you might need to do to better protect your community. So for the first time under this model, and the model, by the way, does not prohibit any technology. It's, you know, come in, and if you could prove that the benefits outweigh the concerns, then you could go forward. And so the first time San Francisco is where our coalition in the Bay Area drew a line and said, you know what, this one technology more than others, it's just too intrusive. It's too ripe for abuse. The error rate is ridiculous. You know, no sensible person should be using this right now for any reason. And so we pushed that in San Francisco rather easily. And Oakland was a little bit more difficult. We still got a unanimous vote, but I want to give those police departments, and actually Berkeley Police Department, you know, credit. They all agreed to a real-time ban. None of them advocated for using this in real time. Like, they just understand that the error rate is too dangerous, too risky. We're going to spend more time chasing bad leads than we would actually solving crimes. And so to their credit, they did agree to a real-time ban. But I expect what you're going to hear, because we heard this and everywhere we've been so far, has been a request to use it post hoc. Like, maybe there's an active shooter, and I've got 3 hours of video to get through. Let me use facial recognition so I can do it in 20 minutes. Or let me just compare it against mugshots when I'm looking for a known suspect. So they want to use it in these very narrow, tight, controlled circumstances. And those, you know, just being fair, those are legitimate hypotheticals. And so the argument that we've been making in the Bay Area is historical, mission creep. No tool that's this versatile will ever be confined to a single or two or three narrow uses. Even in the chief's report in Oakland, where she was stating she only wanted to use it for one purpose, she named 6 different scenarios in her own report. And it's just like license plate readers. That's the analogy I've been using. 10 years ago, they were introduced for one purpose only, to recover stolen vehicles hiding in plain sight. Today, they're used for every single criminal matter. They're used for at-risk locates, witness locates. I've seen it on my private side, in my job, in civil litigation matters, workers' comp, and insurance fraud investigations. Now in the Bay Area, we use it for neighborhood parking permits and payment of fees at parking garages. So it's just exploded. But I could step out of a car or take public transit or ride a bike. I can't separate myself from my face. And this works at a distance, remotely. And I think a real key point we need to remember is the expensive part of a mass surveillance infrastructure, it's already in place. The cameras are already everywhere. Most of them are linked. We commingle databases. We share data with feds and the state. And so that's a really big concern, because you really just need to flip the switch and you'll have a perfect surveillance system everywhere. And I want to just close or address one of the comments. I think it was just the mayor was saying, we actually had this come up about, you know, cell phones and face ID recognition. So the intent of the model ordinance that we've been pushing here, and there's a handful outside of California that are now also law, it's outward facing. And it's really about protecting the public. It's not looking at internal city security functions or your own, you know, use of an iPhone just to unlock your own personal equipment. And so if you look at the Davis ordinance, and just with a caveat, San Francisco is, I would say, the gold standard, but it's a hybrid city-county, and so there's some other language that I just didn't want to confuse you guys with. Oakland's awesome, but our city attorney kind of rearranged the sequence everywhere, so it's not that easy to read. So look at the Davis ordinance, and we have not only the definition of surveillance technology, which you saw on the screen earlier, but also a list of excluded items. items where it's just, okay, they might meet the definition, but the concern is just too remote. It's relatively benign. And so we just said it's not worth the oversight function. And so you guys should do a survey. What do you guys actually have right now? What's the Department of Transportation? What's Public Works using? What's Fire using? And then just say, maybe these items aren't worth covering, but we want to go after the juicier stuff. We'll look at that. And so that'll, decrease some of the burden. But with facial recognition, it really was about the outward-facing aspect. It's not about someone unlocking their iPhone. And another important component, because you guys have been talking about the private side, I'm sure you're aware of the recent stories about Amazon and Ring doorbell partnerships with local police departments. Under our model ordinance, data sharing arrangements are covered. So you still have to go through the same impact analysis. You still have to have the same use policy. You still have to get council approval. You still have to come back with an annual report. And so that's one way that we're looking at sort of this fuzzy area where we're really moving towards with not only just smart city applications, but public and private surveillance. They are combining, and we're getting into sort of a complicated gray area. And so I think our model's been pretty elegant about handling that so far. And so that's just kind of what we've been doing. I'm, willing to talk to you guys, answer any questions, today and going forward. I know we have a really good West Coast kind of privacy group going on with Seattle and San Jose and some of the others, and hopefully we can keep developing best practices together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about, does your regulation have whistleblower protection spelled out in it?
Yeah. So, and I'll email Hector or Judith later, and they could forward to you. I love the Oakland version. The sequence doesn't make sense because of our city attorney, but we have a non-disclosure prohibition, which Davis doesn't have, and really enhanced whistleblower protections, the best in the country.
Thanks for sending it to us. We want to be the very best in the country. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Nick Fish, and thank you for your presentation. I was intrigued when you talked about public and private work to gather data, and I'm thinking into the future where probably the biggest example of that we're going to face as a community is over autonomous vehicles. What kind of privacy concerns do autonomous vehicles and the collection of data by cities pose for us?
The first one is who's responsible. We've actually had a couple robots, security robots, down in shopping malls here where they've knocked over children or bumped into cars and caused damage, and it's like, who owns this thing? Who do I sue? How do I enforce my rights? So that's a complicated area. But I think it's going to depend on the nature of the sharing. Also licensing. We're exploring, I was actually just speaking with Hector last week down in San Francisco about this, along with San Francisco. The genesis of San Francisco's privacy principles was scooters and these other dockless, car sharing arrangements. And they started realizing how much data was being collected and shared, and they didn't have really a great legal mechanism. So they started doing it through licensing, demanding transparency and to see at least aggregate data. I don't know if you guys have researched Los Angeles. They created a standard for mobility dockless sharing and got in big trouble because they wanted to own all the raw data. They didn't really have great privacy protections in place, and CDT and other folks pushed back and said, you guys need to change this. Well, Oakland, ironically or not tonight, is actually putting forward our Privacy Commission's proposal to our city council about this very same data sharing arrangement. And you're able to obfuscate things and to maybe instead of 3 decimal points, you're going 4 decimal points, and instead of maybe capturing data for 1 ride, you capture data for 5 rides. We never promise anybody complete anonymity. It's probably not possible, especially as computing power is going to get better and just more aggregate as data is better aggregated. But to the best of our ability, we try to make it undecipherable as to an individual. And so those are the things you're going to have to look at is what authority do you have? And I think licensing is probably going to be the way we all end up going.
Thank you very much.
I have one more question. Does your ordinance have a enforcement mechanism built in, and is it a criminal or civil penalty?
So I think the original model did have a misdemeanor penalty, and that's been removed. You know, I'm sure you can guess the Bay Area politics. We're not really trying to create another crime. It is enforceable. Ordinances in California can be enforceable as a taxpayer lawsuit, but it's been a lot easier with a private right of action. So all of our ordinances here have a private right of action. Most of them have a right to cure provision. So let's say you guys violate something, or you just didn't bring an annual report forward timely. We would issue a letter saying, hey, you're not in compliance. You have 30 days to fix it, or whatever the time period is, and that gives you a chance. We keep saying we're not looking for gotcha. We're looking for compliance, and so you do get that extra chance to comply.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your work and advice.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. That's been really helpful. We really appreciate your partnership, and you're always being willing to jump in with us into the deep water of whatever we're doing. So if there are no more questions, I think we'll go to our next speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate your time. We know that you are very busy. As I understand, you're running out to Emeryville, California for the same or similar purpose?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Well, we don't keep you much longer. And with that, let me now switch and introduce Claire Garvey. She is part of the research group at the Center for Privacy and Technology in Georgetown University. Her particular work on facial recognition on law enforcement has been very influential in many of our these policies and analyses all over the country. So with that, Claire, are you ready?
I'm all set. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm really sorry I can't be there either in person or via video. That is a technical issue on my end, unfortunately. I'm really excited to help in any way I can as Portland examines what restrictions to place on the use of face recognition or to consider a ban. And in doing so, I'm going to raise 3 points about our constitutional rights and civil liberties and how the technology may impact that I hope is going to be helpful in considering the use of the technology. My remarks, as my research focuses predominantly on police use of face recognition, but I'm gathering that private and commercial applications are also of interest. So I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up about those uses as well. I try to stay up to date on commercial applications of face recognition. Predominantly, it's used in loss prevention or anti-theft, if you will. And I understand that is being trialed by some retail outlets in Portland. So to the sort of legal framework under which we operate here, the first thing to keep in mind is that face recognition gives law enforcement a power that they've never had before. And that's the ability to conduct biometric surveillance. We are not just talking about an image processing tool. We are talking about the ability to identify people in secret, in groups, just because they show their face in public. This power, this new authority raises questions about our Fourth and First Amendment protections. If we think about it, police can't practically or legally secretly fingerprint a crowd of people from across the street or walk through that crowd demanding that everybody produce their driver's license or somehow pickpocket everybody's driver's license, read it, and slip it back into their pocket without everybody noticing. While the use of face recognition on a crowd of people can accomplish these same ends, the identification of members of public simply because they showed up in public. Last year, the Supreme Court in Carpenter noted that for the government to secretly monitor and catalog all of our movements across time and space risks violating our rights to privacy protected under the Fourth Amendment. Face recognition, while not contemplated by the Supreme Court, or really by any court to date yet, there with very few exceptions, face recognition enables this type of monitoring. And while it's not yet commonplace across the U.S. to use face recognition as surveillance, the reality is that the capabilities exist and the legal restrictions don't. The Supreme Court has also held that in a number of cases that the First Amendment protects our right to anonymous speech and association. Face recognition technology also threatens this protection. Law enforcement agencies themselves have acknowledged this, cautioning that the technology can be used as a form of social control, causing people to change their behavior in public, leading to self-censorship and inhibition. That's almost a direct quote from a privacy impact assessment written in 2011, published by a working group of state and federal agency officials, including the Oregon State Police. They took a very critical look at face recognition and its ability to identify folks in public, particularly when it's used on driver's licenses, and recommended very strict restrictions on the use because of those risks, restrictions that we have not seen adopted until very, very recently with the bans that Brian was talking about. The second legal consideration is that face recognition makes mistakes, and its consequences will be disproportionately borne by African Americans. Communities of color are disproportionately the targets of the surveillance, and face recognition is no exception to that. San Diego, for example, found that their police use face recognition up to 2.5 times more on African Americans than on anyone else. Add to this the fact that people of color are disproportionately enrolled in police face recognition systems, thanks to being overrepresented in mugshot databases that the systems run on. And what compounds this is what's been brought up already. Studies continue to show that the accuracy of face recognition varies depending on the race of the person being searched. Face recognition makes mistakes. It's considered an imperfect biometric. It's a very, very new technology. And it's likely that given how police face recognition systems are set up, they will be making more mistakes on dark-skinned people. A mistake can mean you're accused of a crime you didn't commit. It can mean you're arrested. And as I'll touch on in a moment, it could mean you're charged and convicted with a crime, and you may never find out that it was a face recognition system that put you in prison. All of this essentially boils down to the risk that police use face recognition in a way that may not comport with this country's promise of equal protection under the law. And then the third legal point that I want to raise is, left unchecked, current police face recognition practice threatens our due process rights, our rights under the 5th and 14th Amendment. The research that the Center has been doing for the last 4 years has uncovered the fact that police across the country submit what can only aptly be described as garbage data into their face recognition systems, and they expect valuable leads in return. The example that's most often cited from our research is the fact that the NYPD submitted a photo of actor Woody Harrelson to find an unknown suspect in a beer theft. The unknown suspect definitely not being Woody Harrelson. So they essentially used the photo of somebody else to look for their suspect. The Washington County Sheriff's Office in Oregon has submitted drawings of suspects, forensic sketches, in place of photos, despite research that overwhelmingly shows this will not work. This will not lead to accurate identification. This concerning and counterintuitive practice becomes downright alarming when combined with the fact that officers sometimes then skip traditional identification procedures and go straight to identifying or to arresting someone on the basis of a face recognition search. This practice, I think, runs hopefully counter to common sense. It also runs counter to department's own policies and likely to our rights to due process. They raise serious questions about accuracy, the innocence of the person arrested because of a face recognition search. But here's the problem. Defendants are left in the dark about all of this. They're often never told that face recognition was used to help identify them. Face recognition systems produce Brady material, information that under our 14th Amendment right to due process must be turned over to the defense. But by and large, very consistently across the U.S., it's never turned over to the defense. We have a few cases where defense attorneys have asked for this information in their cases when they find out that face recognition was used, and the overwhelming response has been that the case is dropped or pled out, meaning that the prosecution is more willing to drop a case than to give this evidence over to the defense. So to conclude, my research has led me to take the position that a moratorium, at least, on the use of face recognition by police is appropriate and necessary. Jurisdictions that have given their residents a chance to examine the technology, as we've heard, and weigh the risks against the benefits, like San Francisco, Oakland, Somerville, and now Berkeley, have decided that the risks are too great and that a ban is appropriate. As Brian mentioned, it may be that there are common sense rules that a community feels is appropriate to distinguish between permissible and impermissible uses that promote public safety versus those that threaten our civil rights and liberties. But it is past time, but it's the perfect time, I guess, to bring face recognition back under democratic control and allow citizens and their elected officials, rather than executive agencies, to decide how to proceed with the technology. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions about our research, the legal framework that I've outlined, or any other questions or concerns that you may have.
Enlightening. We appreciate it. Commissioner Fish, who usually has the legal questions down and ready to go, has had to leave the room. Commissioner, do you have anything to add? Okay, I don't think we have any questions right now. We appreciate, as always, your partnership, and thank you for being here with us this morning.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Claire. And certainly our group is going to follow up with you and then, as we are putting together these policies, certainly we appreciate your support on all this work. So next in our list, we have, again, Brian Hofer. I apologize. This is my... So we have Pam Dixon. Let's fix this. Yeah, it's
Our facial recognition.
yes, Pam Dixon, and she's actually local to Portland. Pam, she's an expert, global expert regarding privacy, consumer and data privacy research and data. So she's an author, researcher, written a number of groundbreaking studies in privacy, including The Scoring of America, a report on predictive analytics and privacy written by Bob Gelman. She has also written influential reports on medical identity theft, and as well as One Way Mirror Society, a report on digital signage networks, and a series of reports on data brokers, among others. Ms. Dixon has conducted substantive biometrics and identity research in India, which formed the basis of a scholarly article about India's Aadhaar and the world's largest biometric ID systems. And with that, I'm going to show Pam's presentation and let her speak.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here. So I want to preface my comments with just a wee bit of information, because I'm coming at this from a very different place from the other speakers. And I think I'm going to be presenting information that is very different for you. So my experience in biometrics began about 25 years ago, and I've been working in privacy and biometrics for about 30 years. But biometrics intensively for the past 25 years. So most of my work has been in overseas jurisdictions. Oh, thank you so much. It's primarily in the jurisdiction of India and also in the countries of Africa. So in India, after writing a report called the One-Way Mirror Society, which is on the precursors to facial recognition, which is facial detection and signage networks, which are in all of our stores, which you may not know about. But this was like probably 15 years ago. After that, I went to India to study the Aadhaar system as it was being built. Aadhaar was promised to be a system, a biometric identity system for the world's most vulnerable people in India living below even India's poverty level, people who literally had nothing. And it was supposed to provide them with subsidies free of charge and allow them to put either a fingerprint or an iris scan on to get their subsidies. And I thought, this is a disaster. The Indian Parliament refused to pass any legislation to protect the data or to protect the people. So my organization made a commitment to send me there the first year. I spent 3 months there, and I came back and I said, we have a huge problem on our hands. We're going to have an absolute dystopian situation in India. So 2 of us went back, and I ended up living in India for a year doing this work. So at the beginning of the project, 200 million people were enrolled in the Aadhaar biometric without being told what it would do. At the end, 1.2 billion people were enrolled within the space of 5 years. The program began as voluntary, and by the end, it was mandatory. And I think the turning point for me, and when I became absolutely radicalized, was when I interviewed a group of people, and it was women who had been kidnapped from their home country, and they were victims of human trafficking, and they were not allowed to get health care unless they subjected themselves to getting a biometric ID in a different country. And that was it for me. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I can humanly to overturn the system. So I went ahead and asked a lot of different people what I could do, and my most powerful tool was to write up the research that we had done, because no other NGO in the world had gone to India to look at these people. We did. We wrote up the research, and I actually spent about a year and a half getting it published in a very scholarly and well-known peer-reviewed journal called Nature Springer. The Indian Supreme Court took the research and used it as one of their key bases for overturning much of the Aadhaar system. So what I can tell you is that, yes, and so we're taking that work now, we've taken it, and we just held a roundtable of African data protection authorities in Johannesburg, South Africa in June. We're taking our work to countries in Africa to prevent these kinds of problems. So I've seen really significant biometrics problems, and I've seen what has worked to remediate those problems and what hasn't. So my viewpoint is really different, and I'm just going to share it with you, and I am very happy to answer any and all questions you have. Please be aware that biometrics pose profound problems, and they must be addressed. I have a different way of addressing them, but it really works. Okay.
Excuse me,
Yes,
before
please.
you get into your data, could I ask us to have a 5-minute recess? I don't want to miss what you have to say, and I don't want to leave to go to the ladies' room and leave my commissioner by herself.
It's a perfect time. Thank you. Yes. Nice to meet you. representation. You can have identity data, cryptographic data, biometric data, financial data, health data, et cetera, mobile and location. But this data, you don't get to just pull it out of the ecosystems. Again, it's deeply entangled, and try as you might to remove the data from the various ecosystems, you cannot excise it. There are a lot of us who have tried very hard to do this, and we have been most unsuccessful. We can do little bits, especially in the crypto area, but it's not perfect. And there are other approaches that you kind of have to take to fix these problems. Next, please. Thank you. So one of the ways that allows us to provide protections for people in this deeply digital world is to think in terms of use cases. It is possible to take a use case and to excise, to remove a use case from a data ecosystem. And the way you do it is you put profound protections around those uses. So in terms of mission creep, so mission creep is a problem when there is no regulation that stops the uses of a technology. Mission creep is a serious problem with technology. It needs to be acknowledged, and I am really grateful that Portland is taking care of this. It's so important, and I can't emphasize it enough. That being said, if you have protections in place, it actually, not only does it prevent mission creep, you can use those policies as a model to really look through the data ecosystems and then figure out what you need to constrain and what you need to encourage. Next, please. Okay. So we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to jump into kind of the meat of the biometric issue. So I want to talk in terms of use cases because that's where my brain works because of my past experiences and what works and what doesn't. So I want to draw a distinction between surveillance uses of biometrics and investigative uses of biometrics. And while I'm doing this, I need to make a distinction between facial detection and biometrics. So I have a slide in here about how biometrics works. There's something that's happened in biometrics everyone needs to know about. So last year, I was in London. I received a briefing from one of the leading biometricians in the world. And NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, had just completed studying all the algorithms in the world for bias, gender, age, and race, and other issues as well. And the top 20 algorithms in the world that were studied had a 99.98% accuracy rating. The bias differed depending on the algorithm, with one exception. I should say a group of exceptions. Number one, women are always less recognizable in facial recognition algorithms than men at this point in time. That is unambiguous, and there is not a known exception to that I personally know of. Secondly, people who are below the age of 5 at least, and who are also older, also are less recognizable. In terms of racial algorithmic pathologies, you have to go algorithm by algorithm to see what happens. However, that being said, the bottom algorithms, the folks that were at the bottom of the barrel, all tested very poorly for racial bias. Now, I've referred to the NIST study in my statement, and I really encourage you to look at it. It's very hard to digest. I'm happy to help you understand the charts, but there's a list of all the algorithms literally in the world that were tested. There aren't that many. There's about 140 algorithms in the world in regards to main algorithms in regards to facial recognition. And the top 20 are much more accurate. The bottom contenders, much, much less accurate to a very profound degree, as a matter of fact. So, for example, if you're using the lowest algorithm, you can have extraordinary accuracy rates, whereas at the very top, that's different. So the algorithm you choose makes a big difference. With that understanding, I'm speaking about the algorithms that have high accuracy here. I'm not even including those low algorithms. It's very important to understand that there are two very different use cases by government. I'm really speaking about government, not private industry here. So there are investigative uses of biometrics, true biometrics, where it performs a narrowing function. It must be legally authorized, and there must be the proof of a beneficial use. It can't be, oh, we want to do this. There has to be proof of a beneficial use. But then there's surveillance uses. Surveillance uses are not narrow, they are broad. It's like, let's put this, body camera on and let's just go walk around a protest. No, that is a surveillance use of the technology. There is, as Claire was mentioning, I don't personally know of a legal authorization for mass surveillance. If there is one, please let me know and I will consider your opinion very carefully. But I have not yet heard of a legal authorization for this. And then finally, it is not possible really to imagine what is the benefit of doing a mass surveillance of biometrics. There are not benefits there. So I do think that these two uses should be seen as very different. And surveillance uses, I think we can all agree that surveillance uses of biometric technology should be banned. Not the technology, but the use case. We can ban and excise that use case and effectively remove it from the data ecosystem. The investigative uses, I think, needs to be constrained. And I have a lot of structures to present to you to constrain that. It can't just be, oh, you can allow this use. No, it's, you can use this, but here are the huge number of constraints if you want to do that. Next, please. This is a little difficult to see, but it's in your written materials. Basically, on the left, basically what it shows is that for every 10,000, and again, I'm using an accurate algorithm here. This was presented by, or prepared by a biometrician. For every 10,000 people, you will get 10 errors. That is why you cannot use biometrics without a human in the process. This is one of the reasons that surveillance uses of biometrics are so harmful. If you don't have a human in the mix, you're going to have all those errors. So if you add a human to the decision, then you can have almost a zero error rate. However, this is a tightly constrained model. It is considered to be a best practice. In some jurisdictions, it's the law that it's done this way. To use facial recognition without this, and I should say other biometrics as well, is deeply problematic. You've got to have a human in the mix. It has to be adjudication. It has to be a narrowing function only. And that is a reasonable use case. Next, please.
So can I just stop you there for a minute? So having a human in the mix doesn't mean that there will be less bias in what they see and what the outcomes will be.
There's an underlying issue of bias in the law enforcement and criminal justice system. I don't have a cure for that. I wish I did. But I agree with you. I think there is an underlying bias that the technology is going to reflect. So for example, if you're using a mugshot database, you're going to have more people of color in that database. But it doesn't mean that the technology itself is going to have more errors. If the people who are doing the adjudication are properly trained, it's going to help. But it doesn't mean that the technology itself, so for example, biometric technology is also iris scan, or fingerprint, or voice, gait, ear, tattoo. There are dozens of biometrics. One of the biometrics that we're creating standards for right now is the heartbeat. And a heartbeat, you cannot see a color. And the concern I have is that as all of these biometrics come forward, if we don't have rules in place to constrain improper uses, then as they come forward, they'll just come in like a flood and we'll have all these negative uses. But I hear your concerns and I agree with your concerns. So in terms of policy solutions for biometrics, I want to emphasize that I'm talking about all biometrics here, not just facial recognition. So first, if you look at the structure of policy and what it could look like, that fixes, that solves these problems on a very long-term basis, provides real controls and meaningful redress. So first, use restrictions. This technology can be restricted in how it's used. So I just have a categorization of use restrictions there. And then secondly, biometrics as a total type of technology has very significant impacts on individuals and on groups of people and on human autonomy and civil liberties. As such, I view this group of technologies as a hazardous or dangerous set of technologies, much like dangerous chemicals such as lead and cadmium are. Certain chemicals are banned, especially if you're in Europe. For example, you'll see there are approximately 1,300 chemicals that are banned in Europe, many of which are not banned here in the US, but they've banned many chemicals. However, looking across the board, different jurisdictions will make up their mind about what chemicals are unsafe. Different jurisdictions are going to make up their minds about what technologies are unsafe. For my money, I think biometrics as a group of technologies are very dangerous and need strong regulation. So what we did is we looked at the toxic and hazardous chemical statutes across multiple jurisdictions, and we really pulled out the best ideas for constraining dangerous substances from them. And I'm actually going to go ahead and go through those now. So first off, in Europe, there's something called the ROHS, R-O-H-S. I think we're on the next slide. Thank you. Oh, we'll start with REACH. Okay, REACH is an EU regulation, and it applies to the entire supply chain, and this is a really important point. So anyone who's developing a biometric algorithm or system or test database or camera or anything in the supply chain that will be used in biometrics would be subject to the regulation. Anyone procuring it, importing it, etc., installing it would be subject to the regulation. It reaches far and deep into the ecosystem. So the requirements under the REACH Act is that any entity in the supply chain whatsoever must identify and document the risks that in this case, the technologies would produce. You have to do a formal risk assessment. You also have to do a formal privacy impact assessment. Now, there are very robust standards for both of those. You can't just, make a quick list on a piece of paper. The impact assessments that are the ISO standards are many, 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 many pages long. And this is what we want. The other thing, the second requirement under REACH is that you must demonstrate, affirmatively prove compliance, that you have mitigated all of the risks of the technology in this case. If you have not, guess what? You don't get to use it. And then, thirdly, under REACH, you would have to establish safe use guidelines, actual guidelines, not just best practices, but guidelines, and have to actually prove that the product will be used according to those guidelines and ensure that that happens. So that's the REACH. And then next, please. Thank you. And then under ROHS, ROHS is an extraordinarily interesting hazardous substance ordinance. Actually, it's not an ordinance, it's a directive in the EU. However, this directive from the European Union has also been adopted in a number of states. In the US, California, Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and quite a number of other states have adopted these regulations for chemical safety. They're very adaptable at the state level, and I believe at the city level as well. So in addition to the REACH regulations, the idea is that the products have to be cleared for market prior to launch. So in the US, we'll take a product and we'll just pop it onto the market. And then when it's found to be unsafe, then there's a scramble to try to constrain that unsafe product. Well, it works the opposite way in Europe and in these other states, where if there's a product, you have to prove it's safe before it goes on the market. And I believe the same thing needs to happen for all biometric technologies. Again, you see the full supply chain every single party in the supply chain has to provide documentation that they are complying with all of the rules and update things. There's mandatory compliance labeling. So for example, on biometrics, you would have mandatory, for example, labeling on the level of bias in the algorithm, the level of accuracy at its latest test. If there's an algorithm that has a dangerous racial bias, we deserve to know what that bias is and what the exact percentage is and in what circumstances. These are all knowable. These are tested routinely by NIST in an ongoing fashion. You can look on their website. It was just updated last week, and there's no reason why products shouldn't have to have these right front and center.
Could I ask you a question? Who is the, and I apologize, I'm sort of popping in and out.
Yes.
Who is the regulatory agency in this case? When you say that there has to be an overt proof in advance,
Yes.
who is the regulatory agency?
This is the European Commission. In Europe and in the United States, it's
And if
the
we were to
states.
create something similar here at the city of Portland, who would that regulatory body be?
I believe it would be your city auditor.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Next, please. We'll finally get to a U.S. regulation. Okay, so during Obama's administration, he did something really brilliant. One of the brilliant things he did, he passed an update to the Toxic Chemical Protection Act, which has now been updated to be called the U.S. Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. And what that administration did is it took a lot of the ROSE and also the REACH ideas, and they put them into U.S. law. So under U.S. law, the chemical safety regulations, which I believe should be very well applied to biometrics, they require pre-manufacturer notification for new chemical substances. There has to be a mandatory risk assessment, and again, it's a very robust risk assessment. There's requirements for certification compliance, and a lot of new record-keeping requirements. You also, for this particular, because it's a chemical, you have to make a mandatory set of documentation available to the EPA at all times. Now, of course, it works differently at a city and a state level. But these are the hazardous substance regulations that I think are very helpful. In terms of the use restrictions, one of the model laws that's very helpful there is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, yes, you get to use credit reporting data, but you have to get consent, you have to get sign-off, and guess what? If you use it, you have to provide rights. You have to provide right of access. You have to provide right of correction. You have to provide right of adverse action notification. So in the field of biometrics, if someone used a biometric in your life, and it was an adverse decision, you would have to be notified, and you would be able to dispute that. So there are a lot of legislative and regulatory controls that need to be placed on not just facial recognition, but all biometrics, because they're all coming, and many, many jurisdictions in this world
Can I just say that the Fair Credit Reporting Act, to me, is a cautionary tale. I agree with you that on the plus side, consumers can get a free copy of their credit report. On the plus side, they're notified of adverse actions, on and on. What I've also noted from just reading casually in the literature is that it still is an enormous burden on consumers to correct misinformation on your credit report. And it takes a very dedicated person to go through all those hoops. And so I hope we're not using that necessarily as the model, because most people don't have, essentially all that free time to fight with the bureaucracy to get a change. And I know anecdotally and from what I've read in the literature that it's still pretty hard to change an error on your credit report.
Yes, so I just testified about this before the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, and there are well-known pathologies in the FCRA compliance regime. However, I do think that it's better to have the affirmative right to do those things, and you do have a private right of action. You can sue when things go wrong. There's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and prior to them, the Federal Trade Commission, publish a report about about exactly what you just said. It's gotten better, but I do think that it's the regulatory structure itself is quite good. I think that the credit reporting agencies are really tough customers, and debt collectors are also tough customers. And I think you do have to be fairly stout to get through all of it.
I'm glad you reminded us that there's a private right of action. I forgot that. And again, you have to be pretty motivated to use it, but I'm assuming it's a private right of action that is paired with attorney fees if you prevail?
That's correct. Yeah, and the lawsuits in that area are very intriguing. They tend to go a good way, although that's a whole different topic. We can talk about that later. But I do think that the use restriction model is really important in biometrics. There are certain use cases that just should not be, should not move forward. Any surveillance use case should not move forward. Anytime you have this broad-based dragnet situation, it's going to present great issues with civil liberties and human autonomy, and it's a no-go. Yes.
We are leaving over time, so if we can wrap up.
Yeah. Next slide. I think we're at the end. Yes. So one of the great arguments I made in India, and it's a simple argument, but it's that biometrics should do no harm, but they also must create a public good. They have to do both. It's not enough to not harm. You also have to have a public good. And if there's a biometric system that is not harming, great. But is it creating a public good? If the answer is no, then that's not worth our time. And we should look at other ways of getting a job done. But I am happy to answer your questions. This is a very, very technically dense topic. In my written statement, I really encouraged everyone to look at the NIST report on facial vendor recognition testing. It's one of the more important reports that's being published in this area, and it's hard to read, but important to read.
Pam, thank you so much. Did you include that, the name of the report in your, the paper that you sent?
Yeah, it's in the statement.
And so to all of you electeds, I just sent you that paper, forwarded that and the PowerPoint to you.
I should add, they're really, if there is an algorithm, any biometric algorithm that's being sold to the public or used on the public, they should all have been NIST tested. There shouldn't be anything in the procurement chain by any city, state, or jurisdiction that has not been NIST tested. And we shouldn't have any companies with that situation.
Thank you
Could
so
I
much.
ask a question?
Yes.
The city auditor maintains that she only has to do things that are in the charter, so I'm not sure whether she would agree to take on this regulatory function. Is there an agency at the state that would be appropriate?
Yes, it would be the Attorney General's office.
That's more possible, I would think.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Pam before we move to our?
I apologize. I was in and out myself, but I understand your headquarters are here in the region?
I personally live in Portland, Oregon.
That's wonderful. And the World Privacy Forum is located here in the region?
I personally live here. We have multiple locations across the world, but I personally live here full-time. My home is here. I have an office here. We're not formally headquartered here because we didn't incorporate in Oregon originally, but I'm a transplant. I'm a refugee.
Welcome. Well, welcome. We're delighted to have you, and I think you're going to be an invaluable resource as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
Just to close up this session, I want to highlight that this is it's just first steps for a long journey. We are intending to bring to City Council our facial recognition policy sometime later this fall. Follow up with a more comprehensive surveillance technology next year that will open further discussions around biometrics and other surveillance technologies, as well as next year sometime summer, so following up from the privacy work that we are doing, so something related to how privacy is going to be implemented, data governance as well here in the city. highlighting that this is a citywide effort. Also, we are going to bring to your tables many discussions on these different topics. We are going to have more conversations also with community, to open up spaces. The community forum that we had in last September was by invitation only, because we wanted really to target those organizations and groups that are already engaged, so we can start early on that conversation. However, we are intending to have more open discussions, and we have the invitation to you to give us suggestions and guidance on that.
Thanks, Hector. I think actually Commissioner Hardesty has some comments about next steps.
Yes, thank you. So I really appreciate all the expert testimony that we received today. Clearly, this is a issue that is, I believe, at a critical stage. I think the only thing that we're missing is I really was hoping that we would hear from police about how they perceive this, because certainly what we've read in the media has caused all of us to have great concern about how police are currently using this new technology, and then what the possibilities are in the future. So I don't know if you've already had those conversations.
Yeah, well, we were ready. We have Tammy Mayer here from Police Department.
So we have a few more moments. I would love to have you come up.
Can I just jump in here?
Please.
This is an excellent presentation, but it did seem out of sequence. It would have been helpful to get a refresher and a grounding in the law enforcement perspective, where Portland is, and whether we use this technology or something similar, and whether the tool has been, or similar tool has been successful, and what its downsides are. There's a context, and I, quite frankly, I'd like a more comprehensive response. And Commissioner Hardesty, I think we could spend a few minutes having a conversation, but I almost think that diminishes the significance of hearing from the police. I would like a written response that lays out, what's the case for the technology, what is currently being used, what are the concerns that the Police Bureau has, what's their view of the expert testimony. We can't just have these conversations in a vacuum. I mean, we are very fortunate to have 3 outstanding experts in the field, but we still have to have a grounding in what is going on here in Portland, and how Portland may be different, if at all, from Oakland, San Francisco, other places. So, Mayor, I would ask that at a minimum, we get some written feedback from the Police Bureau on this technology. What do they think they need? What's working? What's a first cousin? What are the concerns they have? Do they have concerns about the regulatory approach that we're taking? If so, what? I mean, the way my mind works, it's always helpful to have, competing arguments, so I can test people's assumptions and test their view of things.
Does that work with you?
Could we do both, please? I mean, they're here right now.
I was going to recommend that we do both, that we have the police who have been patiently sitting here listening to the presentation today come up and give their initial thoughts. But I also think that we have time between now and November, when we're anticipating moving forward some type of policy, that we could have another work session, because I also want to hear from the ACLU and the Urban League and other community folks who've really been in leadership roles and actually helping us see the danger of this technology. So, please.
Morning.
We on?
Yeah, you're on.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak. We don't have a prepared presentation for you, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. I really appreciate all the speakers being invited here today. Yeah, I'm Andy Shearer, the Assistant Chief of Investigations for the Portland Police Bureau.
I'm Tammy Mayer. I'm overseeing the Technology Integration Group.
To start with, I appreciate Brian Hofer's comments and his education for us specific to the city of Oakland. How he acknowledged that Oakland has a real-time ban on facial recognition used by the Police Bureau, but I think he said they can request to use it post hoc for some legitimate investigative purposes. And also the comments Pam made about surveillance uses versus investigative uses. I do potentially see that there are some narrow, legally authorized, beneficial investigative uses potentially. But not being an expert in facial recognition technology, I think this warrants further investigation to see what agencies out there in the country have implemented it and under what kind of policies and procedures.
Do you know how that post hoc system works in Oakland? In other words, who is the decider?
I do not.
Because that raises an interesting question in our form of government. It would, under normal circumstances, go to the commissioner in charge for approval if there was no intervening council meeting. And how would that work? So that's an interesting question.
Commissioner Fish, it's the Privacy Commission in Oakland.
My understanding was that Oakland banned real-time facial recognition, but not facial recognition. For example, body cameras. I might be in error, but that's something that would probably need to be clarified. I'm not sure about that.
Well, and I think also we have to take into account how private industries are using this technology. When Ring is actually making contracts with policing agencies in our state to actually be able to gather that data, I have real concerns about that. So whether it's happening at the moment or whether it's happening a week from now or a month from now, I am very worried about private companies collecting data and storing it and then making sweetheart deals with law enforcement so that they get access to that data. I mean, we already have that happening in Washington County today, and if we're not ahead of this, it will slide into Portland, and then we will not be able to stop this train.
I would like to add just that our program, Smart City PDX, is actually working also with our city attorney's office on all that. So we also have the legal framework right for Portland.
May I make a very quick comment? In regards to the post-use of investigative uses, there's a 77-page Department of Justice guideline for how that's done. It's very detailed, and there's no such thing as a match. There is no such thing as just returning one photo back. It's very different. And there are very stringent guidelines for any departments that use it and a lot of oversight. That's included in my written statement. I can send it to you.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I think this has been a very healthy first conversation, and I didn't mean to put Portland Police on the spot because, you're hearing this information just like we are for the very first time. I would recommend that we have another work session before we are headed towards making some determination about what our next steps are, and I want to make sure that in that work session that we bring community members in Portland Police and anybody else who we think can actually add value to what the vision is that we have moving forward. And I want to thank everybody today who made it time to be here and also electronically to provide this information. I think that we're at a perfect time here in Portland because we can be ahead of the curve and making sure that we're protecting the privacy rights of people in our community. And then, of course, the cautionary tale is once this technology, we already know this technology has racially biased outcomes, and we know women also have the same negative impacts from this technology. So let's make sure that what we do here works for everybody. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you for bringing this forward. This is a fascinating topic. It's very, very interesting, and it's very, very complicated. I wanted to make sure I understood Commissioner Fish's request, and I want to make sure it's something that the Police Bureau can do. You had asked for a written survey of what facial recognition technologies are currently being used and how they are being used. Is that what you requested?
Start with, are there facial recognition strategies being used, and are they, if they are, how would they assess their effectiveness? And second, any feedback to the testimony we've received today? Things they agree with, things they have concerns with, best practices they want us to consider. I mean, one of the great virtues of this hearing is we've not only heard from experts, but we have about a week's worth of reading, homework assignments, with the literature that's attached to each person's bio. So I would just welcome, without any kind of formal structure, a response from the Bureau to help guide our deliberations.
Great. And does that work with you?
Yeah, we can do that.
Great.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for
Excellent.
that. And I just want to throw out that the police are not the only bureau that have interest in using facial recognition technology. So we should probably be talking transportation. I think who?
Emergency management.
Emergency management. Hector's done a really good job connecting to a lot of people. So it isn't just police. And I think we've wanted to be clear about that there's a lot of benign uses that people have interest in that we're concerned about.
Yeah,
So,
and that gets to the point I made right at the beginning of the work session. I want to know what,
Yep. Yep.
again, we're not afraid of the technology, we're afraid of abuse of the technology. And so
Right.
the question, I think we need the baseline, not only with the police bureau, I agree with you. I'd like to know what other bureaus are doing and how they're seeing this evolve. I think Commissioner Fish put it in a great way. What's the first cousin of what we're discussing here? And that would certainly help inform me as we move forward.
thank you, and let us know if there's anything else you need from that work session, and we will work to make it happen. Thank you.
Good. Well prepared. Thank you. This was a great work session. Thank you to our guests who made the time to either be here in person or through Skype, which has never worked well for me, so I was appreciative.
And by the
to see
way,
it work well
Mayor,
today.
I think we should also thank our guests for explaining extremely complex matters in ways that are accessible. And on most land use matters, I always ask that the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability team to come in and do a Land Use for Dummies presentation just for me, because I need to sort of be grounded in the basics. And this was not only stimulating, but it was accessible, and it
That's
was
great.
very clear, I thought, and helpful.
Great, super. All right, we're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.